Today
Uh,
is August 17, 2020. My name is Vinicio Cinta, and I am conducting an interview with Professor Maritza Stanchich
mhm.
for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Stanchich, please know that this interview will be placed in the Nettie Benson Latin American Collection at UT Austin. If there is
Okay.
anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor those wishes. Also,
Okay.
if there is anything you want to talk about, please bring it up and we will cover it for sure. Since we are not conducting the interview in person, I will need to record you consenting to the interview and to its distribution. So I will ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say,
Okay.
yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Okay, first question. Voces wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and any other documentation at the Benson Library at UT Austin. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to Voces. First question, do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any materials you provide?
Yes.
Do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
Yes.
Okay. Finally, there's questions in that pre-interview form that you started filling out. That information is also kept to aid in research. It provides context to the interview. The interview, the form is kept in a secure Voces server. Before the form is sent to the Benson Library, any identifying contact information will be stripped from the form.
Okay.
For you and any family members. Do you wish for us to share the rest of the interview and the pre-interview form in a public file available to researchers?
I guess as long as, like you said, the privacy information is guarded.
Yes.
Mhm.
And finally, on occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share phone numbers or email with journalists?
Yes.
Okay. So that is the preamble. Thank you again for agreeing to conduct this interview. And we're gonna get started from the path that brings us to today. So how did you arrive at Puerto Rico?
Well, and I used to have a professional answer, which is true, and that is that I came to work at the San Juan Star newspaper in 1992, 1993, which was an English language daily newspaper in San Juan, Puerto Rico, while studying for my master's degree at University of Puerto Rico in Caribbean and American literature. But the personal answer is that I came with a Puerto Rican from New York who I had fallen in love with. And so love also brought me to the island at that time. I used to always give a professional answer. And now I think the personal one also matters. I think love is a good reason to move to different countries. I also am the daughter of a Peruvian immigrant, and my Spanish had become very rusty, almost embarrassingly so, and so had his. And so we both wanted to improve our Spanish, and that was another reason why we came to Puerto Rico, because we wanted to live in a Spanish-speaking environment and country. So it was all three of those reasons.
So you mentioned before the interview that you're from New Jersey.
Yes.
What part of New Jersey, if you don't mind?
I was born in Jersey City and spent my early childhood in West New York, which was then an immigrant enclave of Central and Eastern Europeans and Latino Americans, and now is much more Latin American. My grandmother lived there. My paternal grandmother, who was from Croatia, present day Croatia, then it was Yugoslavia. They were World War II refugees and came to the United States when Tito was the communist leader of Yugoslavia in 1953. And my mom is Peruvian. There's a history of Peruvian migration as well to New Jersey, and a significant Peruvian population as well in New Jersey. And so after early childhood, I moved to different parts of New Jersey and ended up mostly in northern New Jersey, Richfield Park, and then Harrington Park, which is a much more upper middle class or middle class town. That's considered like a bedroom community of New York City, about say half an hour away or 20 minutes away from the George Washington Bridge from Fort Lee. So North Jersey, the metropolitan area of New York. We used to always call New York City the city, and lived in proximity of New York City. Both my parents later divorced and remarried Cubans, and both ended up in Miami. So later, my kind of familial geography shifted to South Florida. And we always used to joke that, you know, one of my stepmother grew up in Hoboken, came from Cuba at age 8, and grew up in Hoboken. And we used to always joke that both our parents remarried Cubans, and so both, of course, retired in Miami. and so even though we're not Cuban, it really influenced our family, the fact that both of them remarried Cubans.
So how was it? What can you tell us about these different cultures? Croatian culture, Peruvian culture, and then through family, Cuban culture.
Yeah. I'm quite a mix, I think. Most people, when I speak Spanish, can't figure out where I'm from. The fact that I think every story, you know, it has its specificities. So I kind of ironically, my dad was the white European, cultural family influence, but he was the one who really had the most, I would say, traumatic move displacement, because he was a war refugee as a child, and came with a very working class rural family to Brooklyn in 1953. Didn't speak English well, or maybe spoke it, like he didn't finish his formal education because of the war. It's not because of an accent, but he always had some grammatical errors when he spoke. Whereas my mom came from a more affluent background in Lima and had been to private schools, even though she was very limited in terms of gender. They were all girls schools, and they were limited in what they could study, and she felt constrained by those limits, and it was one of the reasons she left. But she technically had more of a Latin American appearance, Latin American accent. When she and my father would look for housing, she would have to wait in the car because of housing discrimination. They would often not rent to Spanish speakers in New York in that time period. But technically she had like more, I think, privileged education. She was fluent in both languages, both writing and reading, in English and Spanish. And that gave her a foothold in post-war America, in order to kind of work her way into more security. She started her career as a secretary in the United Nations. And so she herself was also, because of her bilingual skills, she ended up having a really good, it was a secretarial job, but it was a really good job. And she was also exposed to a lot of, international contexts that way. The Cuban side is, very, some of it is a little predictable, but some of it isn't. So my stepdad, who we were all very close to, may he rest in peace, was truant in high school. So his family sent him to a military school in Tennessee when he was 15. And so he came up through the US military, was a career military man, but ended up being stationed in England for 40 years, where he had his first family, his first wife, and his children. And so he spoke English with a English-British accent. And even though his whole family was in Miami and he was very close to them, he was not a typical, whatever that means, Cuban exile of his generation from Miami. He was a little different because he had spent almost 50 years in England. And we adored him. He's no longer with us. So I say all this with a great fondness. And yeah, the influence in our life, I think, was linguistic. We grew up in a very, almost, now looking back on it, my grandmother on my father's side didn't speak English and lived with us, a nonna, and she spoke fluent Italian and Croatian, and my dad speaks a dying language classified by UNESCO as a dying language called Austrian Romance, which is spoken by a very small rural population in Istria, which is the part of Croatia that borders with Italy. And so they spoke, when they wanted to they wanted to speak with each other and none of us could understand them, they would speak that language. And my maternal abuelita from Lima also lived with us, and she didn't speak English either. So she only spoke Spanish. And my mother learned Italian to speak to her mother-in-law, and my father learned Spanish to speak to his mother-in-law. Both my parents learned Italian and Spanish from each other pretty fluently. So our household when we were young was very multilingual. And when I went to school, it's a little bit like Richard Rodriguez's famous memoir, Hunger of Memory, because in my time period, I was born in 1964, I'm 56 now. The schools were very monolingual, at least my school, which was actually a very good public school in terms of being well financed, but they were very driven toward monolingualism, and they were driven toward eradicating our accents. I remember very clear memories of the teachers pulling me out of the classroom and taking me into speech therapy because of my accent. And they also, in kindergarten, told my mother that they were causing her children damage by speaking Spanish at home, because her children in kindergarten, me, were not following instructions in the group or not speaking. And of course now, it's no accident I'm doing an oral history project, because now I won't shut up. So, it was all, teachers were giving the wrong information. Now I'm also an educator in a Spanish speaking country. And of course now, any of us who know this serious academically know that when children are learning 2 or 3 or 4 languages, they will be a little slow in the beginning, and then they'll catch up, and they'll be trilingual or more so. And that is perfectly possible to raise even tri and quadlingual children once they get past a certain, they get past a certain stage where they're absorbing it all at the same time. So unfortunately, the professionals gave my mother that information, and my mother was very, I would say fearful. She came to the country during the civil rights movement. She watched on TV African Americans being attacked viciously for trying to get the right to vote in the South, and she was afraid. And so she, in the 70s and there was also obviously a lot of Latinos in New York were very proud and were exercising their rights in the streets. But my mother wasn't like that. My mother didn't want to trouble the waters. And so she stopped speaking Spanish to us at home. And of the 4 children, I'm the oldest. The oldest 2 speak Spanish. My sister married a Puerto Rican from New York, and they've been married 25 years and have 3 daughters. And she also studied Spanish in school. And so the oldest 2 children speak Spanish, but the youngest 2 do not, which I find to be something of a tragedy. And of course, Puerto Rico is not Peru, but when I first came back to Puerto Rico and started becoming more fluent, because both my parents were with Cubans, then the Spanish came back into the family and back into the household. So that then going home meant speaking Spanish at home. And it changed, it shifted, over time. And then it probably shifted over time. My mom moved to Miami, which was really a Spanish-speaking city for all intents and purposes, compared to the suburban New Jersey that we were in. And so my mom also had many more Spanish-speaking friends, in fact, and many more Peruvian friends in Miami. And so it shifted. And she would correct me. My mom would correct me when I would speak in the way, say El Yunque about the rainforest in Puerto Rico. And she would say, eso es incorrecto, es el yunque. And she would get very upset with some of my pronunciations, but they were the correct pronunciations in Puerto Rico. And so I would end up defending Puerto Rican Spanish and Caribbean Spanish to my mother, who is Peruvian, but she was married to a man who was speaking Caribbean Spanish with all the, particularities of Cuban Spanish. So then it really became, rich, ultimately rich. Definitely, obviously, tensions too. But I think there's many ways, sorry, it's a long explanation, but there's many, many ways in which that shifts over time and with different events that happened. And even the time period in the country. My mother died being afraid of being deported, even though she became a naturalized citizen because of Trump. My mother died in fear because of Trump. I'm not exaggerating. She watched TV every day and she couldn't believe that this was the country she had migrated to in the early 60s. She was stunned. And I think very much so as a Peruvian, as well as an American, because she had become a naturalized citizen. It really does tell the story of post-war America and the American century, which is obviously over. And this leads us to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is probably the most obvious place in which the American century has ended. And it is a place that is announcing that for the world. The American century has ended, and for people who don't know that, they'll end up knowing it soon enough. But it's obviously clear here in Puerto Rico.
How was Puerto Rico when you first got to the island? How did you experience it being new to the island?
Well, this also contributes to the kind of unusual position that I have now found myself after being here for 25 years and being a professor and having been a journalist, and kind of in a way being able, if I dare say, translate between Puerto Rico and the United States. Before Hurricane Maria, and I'll almost give single-handed credit to David Begnaud from CBS, most Americans didn't know Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens. I would say that changed with Hurricane Maria. And so I was struck by what a different culture it was. I had traveled a bit in the United States, not a lot, but I knew enough about the United States to know that, especially in terms of electoral politics, to know that the South and the Midwest and the West were very different regions, and that some states had very particularly strong senses of cultural identities, like Texas, etc. But when I came to Puerto Rico in 1992, I was thunderstruck by it being a different country and a different culture, and a Caribbean culture and a Latin American culture. I mean, my mom is Peruvian, and it's not Peru, it's not Chile. So it's not Latin American only, it's also Caribbean. And now that I've gained more knowledge about that, I can see why I was so thunderstruck, because I didn't have the knowledge at the time to understand why Puerto Rico was so different than New Jersey. Even Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New Jersey, which I was familiar with because I worked as a journalist in Paterson, New Jersey, Passaic, New Jersey, at a daily newspaper when I first started out. And my sister, who married a Puerto Rican, lived in New Brunswick and made her career as a social worker in New Brunswick, which some people might know is the town where the flagship campus of Rutgers University is, but there's also a large Latino community there, and a Puerto Rican community there. And so it was I did not grow up in Puerto Rican communities. So I was struck by the differences, and I was also struck by, I dare say, the economic and housing segregation that kept me so separate from nearly 1 million Puerto Ricans in New York City, that I knew maybe 2 or 3 Puerto Ricans growing up, and who were in my town or in my school. But all the rest were an hour away in New York City, and even then, in some ways segregated to particular neighborhoods and particular enclaves. And I was really thunderstruck. It was it was a life, obviously, it's one of the reasons I stayed here. It was a life-altering experience that changed my worldview, changed my, the course of my life. And I almost hesitate to use this word, but I'll use it. I would say it radicalized me. At the time, I didn't realize that, but now I do. I think I was critical. Maybe I was liberal. I wouldn't call myself a liberal now, to be honest. And I didn't know anything about Puerto Rico. I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me like a lightning bolt was my complete ignorance about Puerto Rico. And because I had been to a very good school, we had global map skills. We had those geography classes where you had to memorize every single state's capital and look at the maps and fill in the maps. And I thought, how is it possible that this is a US territory of, at the time, now far fewer, 4 million people, with almost 1 million Puerto Ricans in New York City? How is it possible that I am so clueless and so ignorant? That was really what struck me. And then I thought that it wasn't just that I was ignorant, that somehow this had been kept from me, that I had not been taught this. I had not been taught about Puerto Rico as being part of the United States, and I had not been taught that Puerto Ricans were part of such a major part of the landscape, certainly in the eastern seaboard. Now, you could say all Central Americans together are the second largest Latino group, or you could say Puerto Ricans are the second largest Latino group. But granted, the largest group is large and much larger, but it's no small thing, right? That the Puerto Ricans are the second largest Latinx group in the United States. At the time, that was, lost on me, but now it gave me like a retrospective critique of my own education, because I was unbelievably ignorant, and I was I think I've been trying to play catch up ever since. I've been trying to understand it almost in response to that, I came here at age 29, and I felt like it had been kept from me. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm saying.
Yes, and if you don't mind, because I think there's a very interesting question here. You were talking about your work as a journalist too. So that's what I'm interested in. So how was becoming a journalist, how did that play into this relationship to the community, for example, and then learning about it?
I mean, when I started out in journalism, when I was in New Jersey and in New York, I remember working before I came to Puerto Rico, where I met my boyfriend at the time. He no longer is. I was working at a daily newspaper owned by Gannett. And I remember, he's still a friend, like on Facebook. One of our editorial assistants, which is really like the most entry level position in the newsroom, was Puerto Rican. His name was Angel, and we became friends. I think he was, and then my boyfriend was at the time was a part-time writer. And they were the only, I believe, let me think, the only Latinos in the newsroom, and the only Spanish speakers in the newsroom. And I remember, my Spanish was extremely rusty. And I remembered when things like 5 people died in a fire at midnight, we had to tear up the front page and get the story on the front page. They sent me at midnight, children had died. It was a immigrant family. We didn't have Spanish speakers to be able to deal with news stories that involved Spanish, like in the newsroom in 1990. This is not now when I started school. And then I also remember my boss coming to me and asking me years after, like I was there about 5 years, to change my classification as an employee to Hispanic, because they realized my mom was Peruvian after getting to know me. And I remembered saying, but you didn't know I was Latino or Hispanic when you hired me, and now you want me to change the box for you? you want me to help you with your quotas, even though you didn't hire me as a Hispanic. You had no idea I was Hispanic when you hired me. And it was a charged conversation because the implication was that it would help me if I did. And then I went and I asked my friend Angel in the newsroom, what should I do? And he said, well, Maritza, your name, he's like, you're a Latina to me. Angel was like, you're Hispanic to me. And so I really came from the blindness in a newsroom 45 minutes outside of New York City, top-down blindness, to what already was. This is before, the 2000, was it 1 or 2 or 3 shift in them, when the census declared Latinos to be the largest minority group in the United States, surpassing African Americans. Granted, it was before that, but you would think if anybody would have had heads up on that, it would have been entire journalistic operations, much less the largest corporations in the whole country, which was Gannett, one of the largest newspaper corporations. And so it really struck me before I came to Puerto Rico. And then when I came to Puerto Rico, the San Juan Star had a reputation, like, for English is the language, it's a colonial language. It was a very fraught and charged colonial history of imposition in Puerto Rico. The first 50 years of US colonialism in Puerto Rico, all the schools were all in English and all subjects, basically depriving people of their educations. And if they never learned the English fully for their other subjects. Of course, also in some rural areas, there were no schools, and schools were built and American teachers were brought in. So I won't go into all that because it'll be too long. But I was aware. I'm sorry. Stop. Sorry, I'm working at home because of the pandemic and there's dogs in the house. I was aware of the colonial history of English in Puerto Rico, and I was sensitive to it, partly because of everything I just said about my upbringing, and also my professional experience, but also because it was the only English language newspaper in Puerto Rico. Yet, because it was the only English language newspaper in Puerto Rico, it had a reputation at the time for a certain independence within the partisan reporting and kind of nepotism and amiguismo, we say in Spanish. And this is not, this is common to small countries like Greece, the kind of clientelism, which is really a major fabric of the society and also a major source of its problems. And so the fact that it was English gave it a kind of, it wasn't just because it was seen as American in a colonial way, but in a kind of, in independent, criterio independiente. It was seen as being, it was seen as journalistically serious, in part because of that. And then, very specifically, the Cerro Maravilla killings in Puerto Rico in the late 70s, I want to say 1978, when independentista activists from the university were assassinated by police. They were basically entrapped and set up and assassinated, and it turned into a cover-up. One of the journalists that really broke open the story was a journalist from the San Juan Star named Manuel Suarez. And he wrote his book is still the authoritative book called, in English, it's called Two Lynchings in Cerro Maravilla. And in Spanish, it's a gem. It's called Requiem for Cerro Maravilla, por Cerro Maravilla. And so the fact that particular, probably one of the most shocking and horrible events in the late 20th century, the role of that newspaper and that particular journalist was associated with that newspaper. Like, it was kind of like, to make the parallel with the US, it was like the Watergate of Puerto Rico, because they had hearings on TV, just like Watergate hearings happened on TV during the Nixon era. So it was that kind of an event. It was one of the most important historic events of the time. And the San Juan Star had an important role in uncovering or in exposing this. So the fact that I started working at the San Juan Star completely clueless about Puerto Rico. So I guess I was hired. I guess I was seen as having some talent based on my clips or based on my resume or my whatever I brought to it. But I had writing ability, and but I had zero knowledge of Puerto Rico, and I would get thrown into. They had jeeps, San Juan Star jeeps, and they would just say, go to the housing project, the biggest housing project in Puerto Rico, the in San Juan, the Llorens Torres housing project, like more than 40,000 residents, and follow this candidate, Tito Colorado, around. And I would just go, and I was, really looked like a gringa and, sounded like a gringa and really was one, even though my mom was Peruvian, because I was clueless about Puerto Rico. And so I was thrown into it. I remember there was a drought. This is very important because now climate change droughts are becoming more severe. And I have intimate knowledge of covering the drought in the 90s that caused widespread rationing, caused a dengue epidemic. And now, the same exact problems that I had intimate knowledge of, I now have even more intimate knowledge of because they're only more pronounced now. I covered a historic drought which brought me all over the island, to Salinas, to like the agricultural sectors where the cows were lying dead in the fields because of the drought. And so it really helped me learn about Puerto Rico fast, almost like trial by fire, and I did ask questions when I didn't know, and I often didn't know. And I had very good editors, some of them well-known journalists. I worked with, and this really, now looking back on it, I worked with like incredible people, really great people who taught me a lot. Jesus Davila, who is known in Puerto Rico, for example, when Filiberto Ojeda Rios was assassinated by the FBI, he was wounded, bleeding to death from a wound that easily could have been, he could have been saved from. And he asked for the journalist Jesus Davila. That was the only person he asked for. And Jesus Davila was my editor on the city desk when I was a reporter, a stringer, and not even a beat reporter, like filling in for other people. So the people who edited my copy and who asked me questions were very knowledgeable, and I learned a lot from them. So it really was. It really taught me a lot about Puerto Rico, fast, but of course, I still have a lot to learn. I always feel like I'll spend the rest of my life trying to decipher it.
Did the sources or the people you followed treat reporters from the start differently because of this perception that you mentioned, or because of the language?
That's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting question. Maybe with politicians. Unfortunately, and I have to say this, I was 29, and I remember going to buy glasses. I didn't need glasses. I remember going to buy glasses so that I would be taken seriously, because people flirted with me instead of talking to me seriously, in all walks of life, also at the University of Puerto Rico. And people were very nice to me, but they were nice to me like kind of like a pretty, like they treated me as if I was pretty. And they didn't really take me intellectually seriously. It happened to me a lot. And I think it prevented me from penetrating the culture more through my sources, especially in the case where the sources were, men in power or straight men in power. I'm just literally, that was my experience. I went to the optometrist to buy glasses, even though I didn't need them. I thought maybe people will take me more seriously if I wear glasses. And so I was treated more like an outsider, like an American, like and then the gender stuff really got in the, it wasn't harassment, but it kind of got in the way. So I don't know, I didn't pick that up to discern what you're suggesting, except maybe from politicians who would say, oh, the San Juan Star, like they recognized the San Juan Star. But then the politicians were also very guilty of what I was just talking about. People would talk about Cerro Maravilla. if I told somebody I worked at the San Juan Star, they would say, oh, ellos metieron mano con Cero Maravilla. So it did have a reputation, and it might have helped with my sources. The sources that were everyday people were often afraid to talk to the press. And one of the first things that I confronted that was very different from my experience in New Jersey and New York was fear of like the average person talking to the press. I was not accustomed to that. You know, my mom, I adore my mom. She passed away just 5 months ago. But my mom was always very afraid that I wanted to be a journalist. And she always tried to discourage me from becoming a journalist. And I kind of held it against her when I was younger. In fact, I thought to myself, why am I born to somebody who has not encouraged me to do what I want to do? And now that I got to understand Puerto Rico more, I understand her fear as a Latin American, her fear of repression and her fear of journalists being targeted. I didn't understand that at all. And I probably never would have understood it had I not lived in Puerto Rico. I think I have fallen in love with Puerto Rico for such profound reasons. You know, I'll get choked up talking about it. One of them is they helped me understand my mom, being a Latin American who was afraid. And she would be afraid that I would lose my job. She would be afraid that I would get demoted. She would constantly tell me, I would show her an article I would think she would be proud of and that it was well written, but it was critical of a politician. And she would say, you're going to lose your job. And she would get very upset. And I had to stop showing her my articles. She used to say, why don't you write about fashion or movies or something nice, she used to say in her accent. And I wasn't interested in writing about fashion. So one of the things I really noticed as a journalist was that the average person was afraid to talk to the press and would say, I don't want to talk to the press, or I don't want to give my name. And I remembered the first few times I didn't understand this. And that's because I didn't understand the history of political repression in Puerto Rico. I didn't understand the carpetas, the history of the carpetas, the thousands, maybe millions of secret files that were kept on Puerto Ricans involved in the independence movement. There was a nationalist movement that believed in armed insurrection, but there's the independence movement that was completely party-oriented, institutionalized. The repression, the employment discrimination was so great that I didn't understand that when I came here. And what I just encountered was people afraid to talk to the press, and I didn't understand it. So now I understand it retrospectively. But that's really not about the San Juan Star per se. It's more the press altogether, I think. I don't know if the English had an element of that, right? Because just talking to you right now, being that the repression was political and toward the independence movement, would the English have added to that fear? I don't know. You just made me think of it. This made me think of it.
Yes. So you came to Puerto Rico from the get-go. You were working in journalism.
Yeah.
You mentioned a natural disaster, a crisis with the drought.
Yeah.
And when we were transitioning to this period of your life, you mentioned that it stole you. You mentioned the American century.
Yes.
So I guess getting back to that and the 25 years you've been living in the island, I guess this brings us closer to the last decade and the things that have been happening. So over the last decade, you have written about, and you've there was the crisis with energy, which that was happening before the hurricane too, right?
My article on the Huffington Post about the national blackout that lasted for 4 days, exactly 1 year before Hurricane Maria, announced and is in the record that everybody knew that this grid was going to collapse. Everybody knew the condition of this electric grid. So that particular article now is being cited in books about neoliberalism, in books not even about Puerto Rico, to my great surprise. At the time, it struck me, this is, it's like 5 p.m. at night I live across the street from the governor's mansion in a rented apartment, but literally in a very beautiful part of Old San Juan. And I had no electricity, right, for several days. So I was in a restaurant where it had a generator, the only restaurant open in town that had a generator, with my laptop. And it dawned on me, this is a story. Like when I read the damages and when I saw that it happened around the same time as the Grito de Lares, which is an Independence Day holiday here, of an uprising against the Spanish in Puerto Rico. And I mean, it's one of those things that you don't know when you're a journalist. You know, they call it a nose for news. You think, oh wait, this is a story, and then you realize this is a story, and then you write the story, and then later, retrospectively, it becomes more important that you put that out there, because a year later the grid went down and for a year, you know, in parts of the country, and without question led to the nearly 5,000 deaths after Hurricane Maria. So it was yes, I ended up, you know, that's just one piece. But yeah, I studying the crisis in Puerto Rico is so multifaceted. Energy, water, food are what would make 300,000 people leave and not come back if that's the case? Let's see if they come back, the people who left after Hurricane Maria. You know, what does make people leave and not come back? If they don't come back, Puerto Rico is in even deeper trouble, right? Depopulation is going to add to its economic problems. And so those are three major areas, among others. You know, and the debt is related to all this, because the government does not have the money to maintain, much less fix, much less, you know, the government is bankrupt. And the debt, which is a separate question, related to everything, including public education, including public health, is in part a colonial debt, but it is also in part a debt crisis that could be coming for your pension in San Antonio, or in Illinois. Or how is it? Why? Like, I'll just ask you. We're both journalists. Why? How is it that New Jersey, one of the richest states in the United States, didn't have power for 5 days? In Bergen County, one of the richest counties in New Jersey, after a storm that was not Hurricane Sandy. How is that possible? Iowa, out of electricity. California, what's going on in California? With a private electricity firm, not a public one. Northern California's fires, and what now with blackouts because of the heat and the climate change. So the crisis in Puerto Rico is colonial. In other words, it's 1,000 times worse here. And the debt is colonial for reasons I can explain, very technical reasons. But this is the United States. Right? It is a U.S. territory. And these are American citizens. Some might not like, might have very strong feelings about that. But what does that mean? The inequality is really shocking, but it also, I think, points to the shocking growth in inequality throughout the United States. And I do think some of these crises can be visited and have been. If we think about what other communities in the United States famously had fiscal control boards imposed on them, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and most people don't like to point this out, but these are Black populations. The populations that were most hurt by those debt crises, their bus routes being canceled, you know, people who rely on the bus to get to work. People don't like to point here. People here don't like to, or in Washington D.C. don't like to point out that as a country, it is treated as an ethno-racial minority in the United States. In Puerto Rico, it's like a Latin American country where there's wealthy people and poor people, and where there is racial hierarchy and pigmentocracy. But it's very, to me, there's parallels between the fact that Washington, D.C. and Detroit and Puerto Rico have had fiscal control boards imposed on them, and really painful debt austerity. Though, again, this is not Detroit. At the same time, this is later. Like you said, this is 2020. So there's parallels with Greece. There's parallels with Argentina. For example, the same vulture hedge funds that bought the debt once it was distressed are the same ones that bought debt in Detroit, DC, Argentina, and Greece. How is this allowed legally? The first time that the Pope Francis came to the United States and spoke at the White House about immigration, look at his speech at the United Nations. I was very surprised that he spent the entire speech talking about debt. How is this allowed? How is this legal, what has been done to Greece? And this, from the vantage point of Puerto Rico and the vantage point of Christianity and the vantage point of morality, to me, that was a very important speech. The debt crisis here is something that from what I've read, I mean, I'm not just, I'm reading and I'm telling you some of the things I've read. What was, if you think about the American century, if you think about a span a whole time period like that, you think about sugar. Think about the sugar industry in Central America, the American sugar industry in Central, or banana industry in Central America, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. And then you think about, of course, that goes into the late 19th century, and it's linked to slavery, right? That's when sugar became very powerful at the end of the 19th century with slavery, which was legal. And now the exponential growth of wealth is high tech on the Northwest, on the West Coast, and high finance. How is it legal that high finance could destroy the pensions of Greece, Puerto Rico, people who are already billionaires? How is that legal? How is that allowed? Apparently, it's perfectly legal, but that doesn't. It shouldn't be. Of course, the debt crisis didn't start there. It started with a country whose economic development was already declining in the 70s and kept borrowing, and a government that was in both parties, a government that was not changing its ways, and mired in clientelism is a kind word. Corruption might be a less kinder one. Both are correct. And then you think about the failures of liberalism and the Democratic Party. I mean, if Trump manages to steal the election by destroying the post office, we do need to ask ourselves, what were the failures of the Democratic Party, and what are the failures of the Democratic Party? And when I look at like broad strokes and I say it's the end of the American century, I'm also saying it's the end of the New Deal, because Puerto Rico's Commonwealth status, which was created in 1952, is very much part of the New Deal. It very much came about at the same time as FDR, and everything that we take for granted, Social Security, Medicaid, things that didn't exist before. It's very easy for people of my generation who have had these things their entire lives, pensions, to not really stop and think these historically were not always here, and they can be stripped away from us, and we can go back to the 1930s or the 1940s, and that's what's happening in Puerto Rico. The New Deal is ending, and so is the American century, and I fear that will also happen to other parts of the other. I fear that it. I mean, I don't know what's worse, that it just be total inequality, that Puerto Rico just be treated this as a colony, or that is in fact, a red flag for other communities in the United States. I think it's both.
I'm gonna pause real quick because I need to tell you something. Okay, we're recording again, and essentially we're segue. This is a segue between these last
Yes,
and the current crisis.
yeah, yes. Once in a 100-year event. Hurricane Maria, once in a 100-year event. The last time there was a storm of that magnitude was 100 years ago. January, the earthquakes in Puerto Rico, once in a 100-year event. There were earthquakes of that magnitude 100 years ago in Puerto Rico, absolutely devastating, still going on. People living under tarps, still from the hurricane, and now people living under tarps from the earthquake. And now a once in a 100-year event, the pandemic. It's almost hard to wrap my head around what this means for Puerto Rico's economy and what this means for Puerto Rico. And so when you hear the phrase natural disaster, it is magnified tenfold by the debt problem, the electric grid, the water, climate change, which will increase the severity of droughts and storms in the Caribbean region, which are all vulnerable populations in vulnerable countries, which are countries forged from colonialism, countries where the Americas were forged from slavery and genocide of indigenous people. I mean, what makes a region a region? And now the pandemic. There was talk last week of a second closure in Puerto Rico. The governor of Puerto Rico, who is appointed after a governor was ousted for the first time in Puerto Rico's electoral history in August, in July, in the summer of 2019, 2020. The magnitude of the pandemic is going to be worse here. The magnitude of pandemic we know is worse definitively for African American and Latinx communities in the United States, and it is worse in Puerto Rico. But what I was going to mention about the appointed governor is one of the reasons the strictest lockdown in the entire nation happened immediately in the weakest economy. Half the average income, double the poverty of Mississippi. The reason the strictest lockdown happened here was because Puerto Rico has 1/5 the number of ICU beds of a state like Louisiana or Connecticut of its size. And so, meanwhile, it doesn't control its airports. Bahamas closed its airport to Americans, to Floridians. It does not have full control. And tourism continues. And of course, tourism is part of the backbone of the economy. So it's the pandemic here is going to be painful, and would be devastating and deadly should it get out of hand. It would be as deadly as Hurricane Maria should it get out of hand. So I think I could end on that note. It's a kind of personal journey, but also one of the kind of awareness and the kind of knowledge that I grew into while living here and working here, and being critically engaged here, and not wanting to leave, and feeling I will admit, I feel both privileged and at the same time the pressure to leave, and it is a kind of expulsion, economic gentrification. I didn't even go into it, and if we wanted to continue tomorrow, the way that Puerto Rico is being used as a tax shelter by billionaires who don't pay 20 years guaranteed no income tax or capital gains tax, and they're coming and they're here by the thousands. The other ways in which Puerto Rico is being used in this moment of acute and chronic crisis in its history. So I wanted to end on the note of the pandemic. Today was the first day of classes at University of Puerto Rico, by far the most important institution in Puerto Rico. It's premier public university, 11 campuses, nearly 60,000 students, 10,000 employees, 5,000 professors. The only motor for social mobility in the country, known for educational excellence and accessibility. It was not a university you had to go into debt over to get a degree from, and now that has changed. now that has changed. Now its mission is being destroyed by the debt problem and the austerity, and its students are being expulsed. Its graduate students are being expulsed. Its graduates are being expulsed by the crisis. A whole generation of young people, the country is aging, is being expulsed from the country by these forces, by these really, powerful forces. So I think I could end on that note. The reason I'm home is because the university is working remotely, and it's not going smoothly. I could talk about that if you want me to talk about the university. And part of the reason is because it is a mirror and a reflection of the other institutional crises happening in the country.
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly insightful. So thank you for sharing your story.
So thank you.
I think we definitely need to have a second part to this interview.
Okay. Okay.
I'm gonna stop the recording.
Okay. Thank you so much.